Welcome to Just About Earth. Today we ask a question that challenges everything we believe about our place in time. We see ourselves as the first, the only civilization this planet has ever known. But what if that isn't true? What if, long before us, another civilization rose, thrived, and then vanished so completely that the Earth itself erased their memory? In this journey, we won't be looking outward into space. Instead, we'll turn inward, into the silence of geology, the whispers of myth, and the fragile traces that survive across millions of years. We'll ask not just whether someone came before us, but whether we would even know if they had. So settle in, slow your thoughts, and join us as we step into deep time. And if you enjoy mysteries like this, questions that stretch the imagination and soothe the mind, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Just About Earth, and ring the bell so you don't miss the journeys still to come. Because today we're going to ask, what if we are not the first? We are going to take a journey through time, but not the kind you find in history books or the familiar stories of pharaohs, emperors, or ancient cities. Instead, we are going to step much further back into a realm that stretches beyond the reach of written records, beyond even the dawn of humanity itself. And in that vast, almost unimaginable distance, we are going to ask a question that is simple on the surface, but profoundly unsettling once you let it sink in. What if we are not the first? Not the first to build, not the first to dream, not the first to explore? What if, long before our skyscrapers, long before pyramids, long before even the earliest villages, another civilization lived on this planet, rose to complexity, and then vanished without a trace? It sounds like the beginning of a science fiction story, but in truth, it is a scientific question, one that has been quietly considered by serious researchers. When we think of civilization, we instinctively think of ourselves as the starting point, the one and only intelligent society to emerge on Earth. We imagine the story of life as a straight line, rising from single-celled organisms to fish, reptiles, mammals, and finally to us. Modern humans with our satellites, our cities, and our knowledge. We are the culmination, or so we tell ourselves. But the Earth is old, staggeringly old, 4.5 billion years old. And when you place our own existence against that backdrop, we begin to look impossibly small, like a flash of light in a long and silent night. Civilizations such as ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia feel distant to us. Yet even those ages are mere thousands of years ago. In geological terms, that is the blink of an eye. What about millions of years? What about tens of millions? Could something have come and gone in that immense span of time, leaving nothing recognizable behind? The first objection is obvious. If such a civilization had existed, surely we would have found its remains. We would have dug up its buildings, uncovered its artifacts, or discovered fossils of the beings who built them. Surely the Earth would have kept at least a few relics for us to see. But the deeper you look at how this planet works, the more fragile that assumption becomes. Earth does not hold on to memories kindly. It is not a careful archivist of its past. It is a restless, shifting, endlessly recycling machine. Mountains rise and then crumble. Continents drift and collide. Oceans open and close. The surface of the planet is not fixed. It is always being rewritten. Entire seafloors vanish into the molten mantle and are replaced with new crust. Erosion eats away at cliffs and cities alike. Ice sheets grind landscapes down to bedrock. Volcanoes bury valleys under rivers of fire. Over millions of years, almost nothing endures. Even our modern world, which feels permanent to us, would fade shockingly fast if we disappeared. Leave a city alone for a few centuries and vines crack the pavement, roots split concrete, and glass shatters from weathering. In a few thousand years, steel bridges would have collapsed, highways would have crumbled, and forests would have reclaimed the land. Give it 1,000,000 years and almost nothing would remain. Our skyscrapers, our libraries, our satellites, all the things we take as symbols of permanence would be gone, ground down into rubble, buried beneath layers of soil or dragged under tectonic plates to be melted into magma. Even bones, even fossils would not survive except under rare and lucky conditions. And that is the crux of it. Fossilization is not the rule, it is the exception. The overwhelming majority of creatures that ever lived left no fossil record at all. They decayed, were eaten, or dissolved back into the environment, only under very specific conditions: rapid burial, mineral replacement, protection from erosion. Does any living thing have a chance of being preserved? If even the bones of animals are so rarely kept, what chance would we have of finding the remains of an entire civilization that lived millions of years ago? What chance that their buildings, their tools, their culture would survive the relentless grinding of geological time? This is why in 2018, two scientists, Gavin Schmidt and Adam Frank, decided to take this question seriously. They posed what they called the Silurian hypothesis, named after a fictional race of intelligent reptiles from a British science fiction show. The name was playful, but the idea behind it was not. Their question was straightforward. If an industrial civilization had existed millions of years before humans, could we detect it in the geological record? And the chilling part is that the answer is not obvious, because when you think like a geologist, you realize just how easily Earth erases the past. Consider that the ocean floor itself, covering most of the planet, is geologically young. The oldest seafloor is only about 200 million years old, while the Earth is more than 4 billion. That means the oceans have been recycled many times, dragging whatever lay upon them into the deep mantle to vanish forever. Even on land, erosion, glaciers and volcanic activity erase and rewrite the surface over and over again. And so, if there was a civilization millions of years ago, most of its traces would already be gone. The idea is not that we would find skyscrapers buried under Antarctica or smartphones in coal seams. The idea is far subtler. If they were here, would we even know? This is not about Atlantis or fanciful myths. It is about asking whether the absence of evidence is truly evidence of absence, or whether it might simply reflect how thorough Earth is at cleansing its surface. And once you let that thought settle, it becomes deeply unsettling, because if Earth erases so effectively, then even we may not leave much behind. Our own civilization, with all its power and reach, may vanish as completely as any that could have come before. In a few million years, perhaps nothing more than a faint chemical layer in the rocks will testify that we were ever here. So the question stands, heavier now than before. Could others have lived and vanished before us, their presence wiped away not by neglect, but by the natural processes of a restless planet? Could the story of intelligence on Earth be longer, more complicated, and more mysterious than we allow ourselves to imagine? We tend to believe that we are the first, that we are unique, that we are the culmination of life's improbable journey. But maybe, just maybe, we are only the latest in a much longer series. And if that is true, then what remains of them? What fragments, what whispers, what chemical fingerprints might still be hiding beneath our feet? This is where our journey begins. And as we move forward, we'll see how the vastness of geological time dwarfs human history, how the Earth wipes its slate clean, how fragile even fossils really are, and what kinds of subtle signals might still be waiting to be found. We'll ask not just whether someone came before us, but whether we've already stumbled upon their traces without realizing it. Because the most haunting possibility of all is not that no one was ever here, it's that they were and that we no longer know how to see them. When we talk about history, we usually think in terms of centuries or perhaps a few thousand years. To us, the ancient world feels impossibly distant. The pharaohs of Egypt, the builders of Stonehenge, the first clay tablets of Mesopotamia, these seem like echoes from another age. And yet, in geological terms, these events are practically yesterday. The entirety of recorded human history, every battle, every empire, every invention, is just a thin scratch on the surface of Earth's immense timeline. To understand whether another civilization could have existed before us, we first have to understand just how deep that timeline really goes, and how much of it lies outside our imagination. The Earth is not old in the way a book is old or a ruin is old. It is ancient in a way that defies our everyday sense of time. The number itself is staggering, 4.5 billion years. That's the age of this planet, give or take a few hundred million. But numbers like that are almost meaningless to the human mind. We struggle to grasp what even a million years looks like, let alone billions. To give some sense of scale, imagine that all of Earth's history were compressed into a single year. In that calendar, each day would represent about 12 million years. Life would not even appear until late March. Complex animals would not crawl onto land until November. The age of dinosaurs would fill the last few weeks of December. And all of human history, every single thing we know about ourselves, would appear in the final minutes before midnight on New Year's Eve. That's how small we are against the backdrop of deep time. And in that staggering expanse, entire civilizations could rise and fall without ever reaching our attention. We are used to thinking of ancient as 10,000 years ago, but 10,000 years in geological terms is nothing. It is closer to now than to almost anything else that has ever happened on this planet? What about 1 million years? 10 million? 100 million? Entire continents have shifted, collided, and broken apart in that time. Oceans have disappeared and been replaced by deserts. Mountains taller than the Himalayas have risen and then crumbled into dust. Imagine trying to find the traces of a city or even an entire culture after that much upheaval. To put it another way, if a civilization had existed 100 million years ago, long after the first dinosaurs had appeared, but still long before they disappeared, then between then and now, the face of the planet would have been wiped clean multiple times. The continents themselves would not be in the same positions. The climate would have shifted radically, from tropical hothouses to frozen ice ages. Vast inland seas would have risen and drained. In that chaos of constant change, what chance would fragile evidence have to survive? This is why deep time is not just a matter of numbers, it is a matter of erasure. The longer you stretch the timeline, the less survives. Think about how fragile even our recent past is. Archaeologists working on sites from only a few thousand years ago often find fragments, bits of pottery, a few stone tools, the faint outline of a foundation. Entire cultures are reconstructed from scraps because time has already erased so much. If so much is gone in just a few thousand years, what does 10 million years do? What does 100 million years do? The answer is chilling. It erases almost everything. And yet deep time is not empty. It has a record, though it is a fragmented and selective one. Rocks carry memories, though not in the way we wish they would. Sediment layers preserve chemical signals of ancient climates. Fossils, rare and precious, capture glimpses of creatures long vanished. But these records are biased, incomplete and fragile. They tell us more about what survives than about what was truly there. It is like trying to reconstruct an entire library from a few burned pages. And so the deeper into time we look, the less we can be certain of. This is where the idea of forgotten civilizations begins to take on a strange plausibility. Not because we have proof that they existed, but because we see how easy it is for entire worlds to vanish. When you look at a fossilized fern pressed into stone, you are looking at one of the rare survivors of a forest that no longer exists. When you hold a trilobite fossil in your hand, you are touching the lucky remains of a species that thrived in uncountable numbers, but left only scattered traces behind. If nature itself leaves so little of its story, why would we expect civilizations, fragile, temporary, and small compared to the sweep of time, to endure? And this is where the perspective of geologists becomes essential. They do not see the world as we do. Where we see mountains as eternal, they see them as temporary wrinkles. Where we see rivers as permanent, they see them as shifting scars. Over the span of deep time, nothing on the surface of the earth is fixed. Everything changes. Everything is destroyed and remade. The Grand Canyon, for example, feels timeless, like a monument carved for eternity. But even it is temporary. Its walls are eroding, its layers are incomplete, and in time, it too will vanish, leaving only fragments buried in the sediments of some future landscape. And this realization brings us back to our unsettling question. If there had been a civilization long before us, millions or tens of millions of years ago, what would be left? Could we even recognize it? Or would the traces have been crushed, buried and recycled so thoroughly that we would mistake them for nothing more than natural oddities? Already, the fossil record contains countless gaps, entire ages where very little is preserved, whole regions where evidence was erased. For every fossil we find, there are countless others lost forever. For every trace of human culture that survives today, millions more have already been obliterated. This is what deep time forces us to confront. We are small, we are temporary, we are not permanent features of this planet but fleeting visitors. And just as we may one day vanish without a trace, so too could others have before us. Deep time does not care who builds, who dreams, or who rules. It is vast, impartial, and relentless in its silence. And if we truly want to know whether we are the first civilization on Earth, we must first come to terms with what deep time does to memory. It erases, it reshapes, and it buries. And in that erasure, there is both a warning and a mystery, because if the Earth is so good at wiping the slate clean, then perhaps the absence of evidence does not mean what we think it does. Perhaps it means simply that enough time has passed. And in that space of possibility lies the most haunting thought of all. Maybe the story of civilization on this planet is not as short and simple as we believe. Maybe it stretches back further than we can see, hidden in the immeasurable depths of geological time. We like to imagine the Earth as a kind of museum, a place where history is kept safe under glass, where every footprint is preserved, if only we know where to look. But the truth is far stranger and far less comforting. The Earth is not a museum. It is not even a library. It is more like a restless artist, endlessly repainting its canvas, layering new images on top of old ones, until most of what was once there is gone forever. And this means that if we are looking for signs of a civilization before our own, we are searching for traces in a place that is designed to erase. Think about how quickly the world changes, even in our lifetimes. Roads crack, buildings decay, forests reclaim abandoned towns. A forgotten village can disappear beneath vines in just a few decades. But these are only small hints of a much larger process. The Earth has a toolbox of forces, and each one works tirelessly to strip away the evidence of what once was. Weathering, erosion, burial, tectonics, subduction. These are the planet's weapons of forgetting, and when you look closely, you begin to see that survival is not the rule. Survival is the miracle. Start with weathering. It seems harmless, slow, barely noticeable. Rain falls, winds blow, frost cracks stone. But give these forces enough time and they dismantle everything. Buildings collapse, roads break apart, cliffs crumble grain by grain. Even the hardest stone is not safe. A granite monument might stand for thousands of years, but over millions, it becomes nothing more than sand, carried away by rivers or ground down by glaciers. Metals rust, wood rots, fabrics vanish in the blink of a geological eye. Without constant upkeep, even the grandest city is reduced to rubble in centuries and dust in millennia. But the Earth does not stop at weathering. It buries, layer by layer, sediment piles up, covering what lies beneath. At first, this might to sound like preservation. Perhaps a buried city could be protected from decay, but burial is not gentle. Weight builds up, crushing what lies below. Organic material is compressed, distorted, or destroyed. Minerals replace bone, but only in rare cases do they form fossils. Most of the time, burial is not protection, it is obliteration. A house buried under silt does not become a time capsule. It becomes a smear of minerals indistinguishable from the surrounding rock. And then there is tectonic activity, the most powerful eraser of all. The Earth's crust is not a fixed surface, but a patchwork of plates floating on molten rock. They collide, pull apart, and slide past each other. In doing so, they create earthquakes, raise mountains, and open new oceans. But perhaps most importantly, they drag old surfaces down into the deep mantle, where they melt and are recycled. This process is called subduction, and it means that entire seafloors disappear over time. In fact, the ocean floor we see today is geologically young. The oldest parts are just 200 million years old. Everything older has already been swallowed. If a civilization had ever built along ancient coastlines, their traces would now be gone, not buried, not hidden, but destroyed utterly, melted back into magma. Even continents, which last longer than seafloors, are not immune. Glaciers scrape them clean, rivers cut them apart, volcanoes bury them under fire. And given enough time, continents themselves break apart and reform in new configurations. The land we live on today will not be here forever. It is only the current arrangement of drifting plates, temporary and ever-changing. So imagine a city built 50 million years ago on the edge of an ancient sea. That land may no longer even exist. It may be ocean now, or part of a mountain range, or deep beneath the crust. Whatever was built there has been erased. Geologists have a term for this, the unconformity. It refers to gaps in the rock record, places where layers are missing. Sometimes entire chapters of Earth's story are gone, stripped away by erosion, or never deposited at all. These gaps are a reminder that the geological record is not a complete diary. It is a patchwork of fragments stitched together from what happened to survive. And in that patchwork, most of what once existed is missing. Consider the fossil record. For all the billions of organisms that have lived, fossils are rare. Entire species, perhaps entire ecosystems, left no trace we can find. When paleontologists dig, they are piecing together history from scattered survivors, lucky remnants that avoided destruction. The rest, the overwhelming majority, is gone. And if this is true for bones, which at least have the chance of mineralizing into rock, imagine how much truer it is for civilizations. A clay pot, a wooden hut, even a stone temple. These things are fragile compared to bone. They crumble faster, disappear sooner, and leave almost nothing behind. Even when something survives, recognition is not guaranteed. A perfectly round stone might be a tool, or it might be a natural concretion. A strange pattern in rock might be a fossilized structure, or it might be a quirk of geology. Without context, it is easy to mistake artifacts for nature or to miss them altogether. And when millions of years have passed, context is exactly what is lost. So when we ask whether another civilization could have existed long before us, the real obstacle is not plausibility, it is preservation. The Earth is too efficient at erasing. It does not keep records out of kindness. It keeps them only by accident. And even then, only in rare circumstances. To find anything at all from the deep past is extraordinary. To expect an entire civilization to survive intact is almost impossible. And yet impossibility is not certainty. Some things do last. Some things resist the eraser, leaving behind faint but stubborn marks, chemical changes in the atmosphere, shifts in carbon isotopes, strange concentrations of metals, layers of ash. These are not monuments or cities, but they are clues, written not in architecture but in chemistry. And this is where scientists now look. Because if the Earth erases almost everything, then the things it cannot erase may be the only signs that anyone was ever here. So, as we move forward, the picture becomes both darker and more intriguing. Civilization may not leave behind grand ruins for us to find. It may leave only subtle fingerprints, hidden in rock and soil, waiting to be noticed. And this means that when we look for evidence of others, we must think differently, not as archaeologists searching for temples, but as detectives searching for anomalies, because the Earth erases, but it does not erase perfectly, and in those imperfections may lie the faintest whispers of a story older than our own. When we think of civilization, we tend to imagine permanence. Skyscrapers reaching into the sky, bridges spanning vast rivers, highways stretching across continents. We think of our libraries, our digital archives, our satellites silently orbiting the Earth, and we feel secure. Surely all of this will be remembered. Surely all of this will last. But that sense of permanence is an illusion, a trick of perspective born from our short lifespans. Civilization is fragile, far more fragile than we want to believe, and the Earth wastes no time in proving it. Imagine for a moment that humanity vanished tomorrow, not with war, not with fire, not with a sudden apocalyptic event, but simply gone, every person disappearing in an instant. What would happen to our world in the days, years, and centuries that followed? At first, almost nothing would change. Cities would remain lit. Trains would sit idle on their tracks. Airplanes would be parked at airports, waiting for passengers who would never arrive. But within days, power plants would fail. Without people to maintain them, electricity would flicker out. Subways would flood as pumps shut down. Food in refrigerators would rot, and the slow work of decay would begin. A year later, nature would already be reclaiming its space. Weeds and grasses would push through cracks in sidewalks. Trees would begin to take root in rooftops. Rodents, birds, and insects would flourish in the absence of pest control. Larger animals would return to our cities, exploring spaces once ruled by humans. Within decades, structures would start to fail. Glass windows would shatter, metal beams would rust, and concrete would fracture. Skyscrapers, which now seem eternal, would collapse under their own weight as their steel cores corroded and their foundations weakened. In 100 years, many cities would look more like forests than metropolises. Roads would still be faintly visible from above, but they would be broken and covered in vegetation. Bridges would fall into rivers. Dams would crack and collapse, flooding valleys that had been carefully managed. The outlines of human presence would still be there, but faint, like scars on the skin of the earth. And yet, in geological terms, even this would be temporary. 10,000 years from now, almost nothing of our modern world would remain recognizable. Forests would cover what were once cities. Deserts would shift over old highways. Coastlines would have changed, swallowing some areas in rising seas while exposing others as land. The great monuments of today, our tallest towers, our grandest structures, would be rubble. Only a few stubborn stoneworks, perhaps Mount Rushmore, the pyramids, or the faces of monuments carved into mountainsides, might still stand in some form, but even they would be worn, cracked, and fading into natural shapes. Go forward 100,000 years, and even those traces are doubtful. The planet's cycles of ice and heat, its erosion and tectonic shifts would erase most of what we left behind. Perhaps some underground structures, mines, tunnels, or vaults would survive a little longer. Perhaps a few artifacts sealed in caves or deserts might be found, but by then the world would be almost unrecognizable as the one we inhabit now. And what about a million years? By then the answer is clear: almost nothing. A few subtle chemical signatures might remain in the soil. Some plastics, buried deep enough, might survive in microscopic fragments. A thin layer in the rock record might show an unusual concentration of carbon, nitrogen, or synthetic elements. But our roads, our cities, our art, our technology, gone. From the perspective of deep time, human civilization is not built of stone and steel, it is built of dust. And this realization is more than humbling, it is frightening, because if this is true for us, then it must also be true for any who may have come before. If a civilization existed 10 million years ago, 50 million years ago, or even 100 million years ago, then their story would already be erased. The earth would have reclaimed their cities, digested their bones, and recycled their tools into new rock. We would not find their monuments in museums, we would not stumble across their machines intact. We would only find, if we found anything at all, faint traces, anomalies, whispers. And yet, this fragility also holds a strange irony, because for all of our technological achievements, for all of our engineering marvels, our most enduring legacies may not be the things we built, but the things we changed. Consider how we have altered the atmosphere with carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and synthetic chemicals. Consider the radioactive isotopes left behind from nuclear testing. Consider the plastics now scattered across oceans and buried in sediments worldwide. These are not monuments in the traditional sense, but they are signatures. If a civilization millions of years from now dug into the layers of Earth, they would not find our cities, but they might find the chemical fingerprints of our presence. And here lies the uncomfortable question. If we are fragile, then were they? If another civilization lived here long ago, then perhaps they too left chemical marks, subtle disturbances in the rock record that we have mistaken for natural processes. When we find sudden spikes in carbon isotopes, unusual deposits of metals, or abrupt shifts in biodiversity, we assume volcanoes, asteroid impacts, or natural climate change. And most of the time we are probably right. But what if just once we are not? What if one of those anomalies is not a natural disaster at all, but the faint afterimage of someone else's age? This is why the fragility of civilization matters. Not just because it humbles us, but because it shapes the way we search. We cannot look for pyramids buried under mountains. We cannot expect machines to survive in coal seams. We must think differently. We must look for what endures, not the monuments, but the residues. Not the buildings, but the fingerprints. Civilization is fragile, but fragility leaves shadows, and shadows can sometimes outlast the things that cast them. So when we think of ourselves, of our own place in this story, the realization is sobering. We are not permanent, we are not immune to time. And if the earth erases us so thoroughly, then it may already have erased others. If we want to find them, we must stop asking what they built and start asking what they changed. Because what they changed, however faint, may be all that still remains. When most of us picture fossils, we think of a museum display, a towering dinosaur skeleton assembled bone by bone, or a perfect ammonite spiraled into stone as if frozen in time. These images give the impression that fossils are common, that the earth is generous in preserving its past. But the truth is the opposite. Fossils are rare. In fact, they are the exceptions in a world designed to forget. And once you begin to understand just how rare they are, the question of whether an earlier civilization could have vanished without leaving a trace becomes far less far-fetched. Fossilization is not a natural outcome of death, it is an extraordinary accident. The overwhelming majority of living things that have ever existed left nothing behind. They decomposed, were eaten, dissolved, or simply faded into the soil. For a body to become a fossil, an unlikely chain of events must occur. The organism must die in a place where it can be buried quickly before scavengers and bacteria destroy it. It must be covered by sediment in just the right way, in just the right environment. Then, over thousands or millions of years, its tissues must be replaced by minerals, transformed into stone while still maintaining the shape of what it once was. And even then, survival is not guaranteed. The fossil must avoid destruction by erosion, tectonic shifts, or the endless grinding of Earth's cycles. Finally, it must be exposed again, lifted to the surface where it can be found. That is a nearly impossible series of conditions, and yet it happens, rarely, giving us glimpses of life from ages past. But for every fossil we have in our museums, there are countless creatures that left no trace. Whole species, perhaps whole ecosystems, have been lost from the record entirely. What we know of Earth's history is not the complete story. It is a patchwork of survivors. Think about that for a moment. The dinosaurs ruled the Earth for over 160 million years. They were everywhere, in every ecosystem. And yet, when we look at the fossil record, we do not see the full story of their lives. We see fragments, a few bones, a scattering of teeth, the occasional imprint of skin or feather. Imagine an alien civilization trying to reconstruct humanity from only a few skeletons, a handful of tools, and some scattered footprints. That is what paleontology is like. It is detective work with most of the evidence missing. And if that is the case for dinosaurs, which were abundant, enormous, and lasted for tens of millions of years, what does it mean for civilizations? Civilizations are smaller, shorter-lived, and made of materials far less durable than bone. Even our stone monuments are young compared to geological time. Most buildings are made of concrete, wood, or metal, all of which decay rapidly. If we disappeared tomorrow, in a few thousand years, only fragments would remain. In a million years, almost nothing. In 10 million years, any trace of us would be as rare as fossils are today, perhaps rarer still. Even the fossils we do have are biased. Certain environments preserve better than others. Lakes, river deltas, and shallow seas are fossil factories compared to forests, deserts, or mountains. Creatures that lived in fossil-friendly environments are overrepresented. Creatures in harsher environments may as well have never existed, as far as the record is concerned. Now imagine a civilization that arose not in fossil-rich plains, but in rainforests, swamps, or coastal regions that later sank beneath the sea. Their remains would have been erased almost immediately. Their bones would rot, their structures collapse, and the ocean would scatter their memory into silence. And then there is the problem of recognition. Even when fossils survive, they are not always obvious. A fragment of bone may look like an ordinary rock. A stone chipped into a tool might be dismissed as a natural break. Without context, without a clear pattern, many traces could be overlooked or misinterpreted. Archaeologists often debate whether a sharp rock is the product of human design or just chance fracture. Extend that debate millions of years into the past, and the line becomes even blurrier. Could we already have found signs of something older, something stranger, and filed it away as natural? It is possible. The fossil record also hides another truth: gaps. There are stretches of time where we have almost nothing, blank pages in Earth's story. Sometimes this is because erosion removed layers. Sometimes it is because nothing fossilized. These gaps can last millions of years, entire ages of life lost without a single trace. To us, it feels like those ages were empty, but they were not. They were simply erased. And if a civilization lived in one of those gaps, we might never know. Even with our own ancestors, the record is frustratingly incomplete. Homo erectus lived for nearly 2 million years, a species far older than our own. And yet what do we have of them? A handful of skulls, some tools, traces of fire. We do not know their languages, their beliefs, or their full culture. Entire chapters of their existence are invisible to us. If this is what we see after only 2 million years, then what happens after 50 million? After 100 million, the odds collapse to almost nothing. And yet, some scientists argue that fossils, or the lack of them, are not the only path forward. Perhaps the best way to search for ancient civilizations is not to look for bones or tools at all, but for chemical signals. The fingerprints of activity written into the soil and sent in. 1. This is where the Silurian hypothesis enters again. If a civilization had burned fossil fuels, for instance, it would leave behind carbon isotopic shifts. If it mined metals, unusual concentrations might remain in ancient layers. If it manufactured synthetic compounds, traces might survive in sediments. These would not be fossils in the traditional sense, but they would be just as telling. And here's where the suspense deepens. We already find chemical anomalies in the record: sudden spikes of carbon, mysterious layers of metals, abrupt climate shifts. We explain them with volcanoes, with asteroid impacts, with natural disasters. And perhaps that is always the right answer, but perhaps, in at least one case, it is not. Perhaps one of those anomalies is the faint fossil of a civilization, a trace so subtle that we do not yet recognize it for what it is. The rarity of fossils reminds us of a sobering truth. The Earth does not preserve the full story. It preserves fragments, and only the lucky fragments. Everything else disappears. So when we ask whether someone came before us, we must remember that absence is not proof. The silence of the fossil record may not mean there was nothing there. It may simply mean that, like so much else, it has been lost to time. And that thought should keep us cautious but also curious. Because if civilizations are fragile and fossils are rare, then the traces we do find, whether bone, stone, or chemical, take on enormous importance. They are the whispers of a planet that forgets almost everything. And sometimes in those whispers there may be more than we expect. In 2018, two scientists posed a question that sounded less like something from a peer-reviewed journal and more like the opening of a science fiction novel. Gavin Schmidt, a climate scientist at NASA, and Adam Frank, an astrophysicist, asked, if an industrial civilization had existed on Earth millions of years before humans, would we be able to detect it today? They called this thought experiment the Silurian hypothesis, named after a fictional race of intelligent reptiles from a British science fiction show. The name was playful, but the question behind it was anything but. The first thing Schmidt and Frank pointed out is that we would not find skyscrapers buried under Antarctica or laptops fossilized in coal seams. Deep time is merciless. Anything built of wood, metal, or plastic would be gone in just thousands of years. Even concrete, which feels indestructible to us, would crumble into dust long before a million years passed. The Earth erases. And so if an earlier civilization had existed, we could not expect to find their tools or their monuments waiting for us intact. Instead, the question becomes, what else could they have left behind? The answer lies in chemistry. Every civilization, simply by existing, alters the planet. It uses energy, extracts resources, and leaves behind waste. Human civilization is no different. We burn fossil fuels, changing the balance of carbon isotopes in the atmosphere. We release nitrogen through fertilizers. We scatter plastics, pesticides, and industrial byproducts across land and sea. We have even created radioactive isotopes that do not occur naturally in significant amounts, and all of these changes are being written into the Earth's layers right now. So Schmidt and Frank asked, what if this has happened before? If another industrial civilization had once flourished, what traces of its activity would still be visible millions of years later? And how would we tell them apart from natural events? They began by looking at isotopes. Burning fossil fuels releases carbon with a distinctive signature. Specifically, it lowers the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 in the atmosphere. This shift can be preserved in sediment layers. Today, geologists can already measure the impact of human activity in the isotopic record. If something similar happened in the distant past, it might suggest large-scale combustion of fossil fuels, even if the civilization itself was long gone. Then there are synthetic molecules, plastics, pesticides, and industrial chemicals. Many of these are designed to resist decay. Microscopic fragments of plastic called microplastics are already turning up everywhere, from ocean trenches to polar ice. Some of these substances could, in theory, persist for hundreds of thousands or even millions of years if buried in the right conditions. Imagine a future geologist drilling into ancient rock and finding polymers that nature cannot produce. What would they conclude? Mining and metallurgy leave their own fingerprints. Refining metals concentrates elements in ways that rarely happen naturally. Industrial civilization creates unusual distributions of lead, cadmium, or rare earth elements. If a previous civilization had done the same, those signatures might still exist in old sediments. But would we recognize them, or would we assume they came from volcanic activity, hydrothermal vents, or asteroid impacts? Another possible signal is extinction. Human activity has already accelerated the rate at which species disappear. Many scientists argue we are in the midst of a sixth mass extinction. These die-offs are visible in the fossil record, marked by sudden declines in biodiversity. If another civilization had disrupted ecosystems on a global scale, it might have caused a similar spike. But the problem is interpretation. Was it caused by industry or by natural disaster? This is the central challenge of the Silurian hypothesis. Even if traces exist, how do we separate them from Earth's own chaotic history? For example, 56 million years ago, during the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, the planet experienced a sudden rise in temperature, ocean acidification, and major shifts in carbon isotopes. The event looks eerily similar to what is happening today, yet we attribute it to natural causes, perhaps massive volcanic eruptions or methane releases. But could such events be mistaken signatures of a vanished civilization? Schmidt and Frank were careful not to claim that they were. Their point was more unsettling. We wouldn't know. This realization forces us to change how we think about civilizations in deep time. Instead of looking for artifacts or ruins, we must look for anomalies, subtle chemical patterns that stand out against the background rhythm of Earth's geology. It requires us to think like detectives investigating a crime scene where the body, the weapon, and the witnesses are all gone. The only hope is to study the wallpaper, the dust, the faint disturbances left behind. And here's where the thought experiment turns inward. Because in asking how to detect a past civilization, Schmidt and Frank also highlight the fragility of our own. If we vanish today, what would remain of us in 10 million years? Not our buildings, not our art, not even most of our bones. What would remain are chemical signals, plastic residues, carbon isotope shifts, radioactive isotopes, and unusual distributions of metals. Those would be our fossils, not in shape, but in chemistry. A thin line in the rock, an anomaly in the data. That is our legacy. And if that is our legacy, then perhaps it was theirs too. Perhaps in some ancient layer we have already found such anomalies. Perhaps we have already measured spikes of carbon or traces of unusual compounds and dutifully labeled them as natural events. Perhaps we are already holding the fingerprints of a lost civilization without realizing that is what they are. The Silurian hypothesis does not claim that others came before us. It does not point to specific evidence. Instead, it asks a methodological question. How would we know if they had? And the answer is chilling in its uncertainty. We might not know at all. Deep time erases and Earth disguises. The absence of evidence may not be evidence of absence. It may simply be the silence left behind when a planet resets itself every few 100 million years. And so the hypothesis lingers, half unsettling, half inspiring. It reminds us that we are not as permanent as we think. It reminds us that civilizations may rise and fall without leaving obvious monuments. And it pushes us to look differently, not for statues in the desert or temples under the sea, but for subtle signatures in rock and soil. Because if someone came before us, their story would not be carved in stone. It would be written in chemistry, waiting for us to learn how to read it. If we accept that most of what we build will vanish, then the next question is obvious. What does endure? What, if anything, can survive the relentless churn of geological time? Because if we are to imagine that another civilization once lived on this planet, the only hope of finding them lies in the things that Earth itself cannot easily erase. Not monuments, not machines, but something subtler, something stubborn, something that lingers long after the rest has been reduced to dust. The first and perhaps most surprising candidate is chemistry. Civilizations change the composition of their environment. They dig, they burn, they refine, they synthesize. In doing so, they alter the balance of elements and molecules in ways that nature does not usually replicate. These changes may not look like pyramids or roads, but they are signatures all the same. Signatures that can be locked into sediments, ice cores, and rock layers for millions of years. Take plastics, for example. They are everywhere in our world, from bottles and bags to carpets and car parts. Plastics are not natural. They are synthetic polymers created by human industry. And although many degrade in sunlight or when exposed to oxygen, fragments called microplastics already litter every corner of the Earth. They are in the deepest ocean trenches, the polar ice caps, the soils of mountains and deserts. Some of these fragments may last for tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years if buried in low oxygen environments. Now imagine layers of sediment forming above them. A future geologist, millions of years from now, might drill into that layer and find particles that no natural process can explain. That would be our fingerprint. And if it is ours, could someone else have left a similar one before us? Metals tell another story. We think of metal as durable, and in human terms it is. Bronze swords, Iran. On nails and gold jewelry survive for centuries, but metals corrode. Iron rusts, copper oxidizes, even stainless steel eventually succumbs. Over millions of years, very little remains. And yet, refining and concentrating metals leaves behind chemical signatures. Modern industry produces unusual distributions of lead, mercury, cadmium, and rare earth elements. These are scattered across soils and waterways, building up in layers of sediment. A million years from now, even if no artifacts survive, those chemical patterns might still be visible. They might appear as strange spikes in the geological record, evidence of a process not purely natural. Radioactive isotopes are another clue. Some elements humans have created do not exist in nature at all, or occur only in trace amounts. Nuclear reactors and weapons testing have scattered isotopes like plutonium-244 and technetium-99 across the globe. Some decay quickly, but others linger. Even after millions of years, tiny anomalies in isotopic ratios could hint at their presence. Imagine a civilization that used nuclear technology millions of years ago. Its bombs and power plants would be gone, but faint traces of unusual isotopes might still remain in ancient rock. Concrete, too, has its peculiar resilience. Our modern formulations can last for thousands of years, and Roman concrete has already survived for 2 millennia in seawater. Over time, concrete chemically changes, often growing stronger as minerals continue to form within it. Could fragments of concrete survive millions of years? Perhaps not as recognizable walls or buildings, but as strange mineral formations, unlike typical stone. To a future geologist, they might look natural unless studied carefully. If we accept that most of what we build will vanish, then the next question is obvious. What does endure? What, if anything, can survive the relentless churn of geological time? Because if we are to imagine that another civilization once lived on this planet, the only hope of finding them lies in the things that Earth itself cannot easily erase. Not monuments, not machines, but something subtler, something stubborn, something that lingers long after the rest has been reduced to dust. The first and perhaps most surprising candidate is chemistry. Civilizations change the composition of their environment. They dig, they burn, they refine, they synthesize. In doing so, they alter the balance of elements and molecules in ways that nature does not usually replicate. These changes may not look like pyramids or roads, but they are signatures all the same. Signatures that can be locked into sediments, ice cores, and rock layers for millions of years. Take plastics, for example. They are everywhere in our world, from bottles and bags to carpets and car parts. Plastics are not natural. They are synthetic polymers created by human industry. And although many degrade in sunlight or when exposed to oxygen, fragments called microplastics already litter every corner of the Earth. They are in the deepest ocean trenches, the polar ice caps, the soils of mountains and deserts. Some of these fragments may last for tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years if buried in low oxygen environments. Now imagine layers of sediment forming above them. A future geologist, millions of years from now, might drill into that layer and find particles that no natural process can explain. That would be our fingerprint. And if it is ours, could someone else have left a similar one before us? Metals tell another story. We think of metal as durable, and in human terms it is. Bronze swords, Iran. On nails and gold jewelry survive for centuries, but metals corrode. Iron rusts, copper oxidizes, even stainless steel eventually succumbs. Over millions of years, very little remains. And yet, refining and concentrating metals leaves behind chemical signatures. Modern industry produces unusual distributions of lead, mercury, cadmium, and rare earth elements. These are scattered across soils and waterways, building up in layers of sediment. A million years from now, even if no artifacts survive, those chemical patterns might still be visible. They might appear as strange spikes in the geological record, evidence of a process not purely natural. Radioactive isotopes are another clue. Some elements humans have created do not exist in nature at all, or occur only in trace amounts. Nuclear reactors and weapons testing have scattered isotopes like plutonium-244 and technetium-99 across the globe. Some decay quickly, but others linger. Even after millions of years, tiny anomalies in isotopic ratios could hint at their presence. Imagine a civilization that used nuclear technology millions of years ago. Its bombs and power plants would be gone, but faint traces of unusual isotopes might still remain in ancient rock. Concrete, too, has its peculiar resilience. Our modern formulations can last for thousands of years, and Roman concrete has already survived for 2 millennia in seawater. Over time, concrete chemically changes, often growing stronger as minerals continue to form within it. Could fragments of concrete survive millions of years? Perhaps not as recognizable walls or buildings, but as strange mineral formations, unlike typical stone. To a future geologist, they might look natural unless studied carefully. And then there are ceramics and glass. These materials are chemically stable, resistant to decay, and often survive long after other artifacts are gone. Archaeologists today often find shards of pottery when all else has vanished. Scale that forward in time, and it is possible that some fragments of our ceramics, tiles, dishes, or even glass could survive millions of years if buried in the right conditions. They would not tell the full story of our civilization, but they would whisper that something was here. But perhaps the most enduring markers are not physical objects at all, but changes to ecosystems. Civilizations reshape the land. They clear forests, redirect rivers, and till soil. Agriculture transforms the chemistry of the ground itself, adding nitrogen, phosphorus, and salts. These changes can last long after fields have gone fallow. In fact, soil profiles, thousands of years old, still bear the signatures of ancient farming. Extrapolate further. Could a civilization millions of years ago have altered landscapes so deeply that their scars remain even today? If so, they would be nearly impossible to distinguish from natural changes unless we knew what to look for. And this brings us to the unsettling thought. Perhaps we have already seen signs of endurance without realizing it. Geologists sometimes find anomalies in the record, strange spikes in carbon, odd concentrations of metals, abrupt shifts in biodiversity. These are usually explained as volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, or climate events. And perhaps they always are, but what if just once they are not? What if one of those anomalies is the faint echo of a civilization that lived, thrived, and fell long before us? This is why endurance matters, because while most things vanish, not everything does. Something always remains. And those remnants, faint as they are, may be enough to tell a story if only we learn how to listen. The Earth is a master at erasure, but it is not perfect. It leaves behind fingerprints, thin layers in rock, chemical scars, strange materials, and in those fingerprints may lie the only chance of glimpsing what came before. For us, it is a humbling lesson. We like to think of our monuments as eternal, but they are not. What will truly endure of humanity may not be our skyscrapers or our art, but our waste. The plastics in the sea, the isotopes in the soil, the chemicals in the atmosphere. These, not our great works, will be the fossils of our civilization. And if that is true for us, it may have been true for others. If someone came before, their monuments are gone, but their fingerprints, chemical, geological, ecological, may still be faintly visible, waiting for us to recognize them. And so the question sharpens. When we look at the rock record, when we examine the soil, when we drill into sediments, are we sure we know what we are seeing? Or are we staring at the stubborn remnants of something older than we dare imagine? When we think of lost civilizations, we often imagine them buried beneath deserts or hidden in jungles. But the truth is, the most likely resting place for humanity's remains, or any civilizations, will not be the sands of Egypt or the forests of the Amazon. It will be the ocean. The ocean is where civilizations rise, and it is where they are erased most completely. For all our achievements, all our monuments, and all our stories, the sea has always been both our partner and our destroyer. And in deep time, it is the ocean's silence that is the most formidable eraser of all. Consider where humans build. The world's greatest cities are clustered along coasts and rivers: New York, London, Tokyo, Shanghai, Rome, Alexandria. We live by water because it feeds us, transports us, and connects us. Ancient civilizations were no different. Mesopotamia rose along the Tigris and Euphrates. Egypt thrived on the Nile. The Harappan civilization grew along the Indus. Water has always been civilization's foundation. But the sea is never still, never patient, never permanent. It rises, it falls, it shifts its shorelines, and in doing so, it takes what we build and scatters it until even the memory is gone. If humanity were to vanish today, our coastal cities would be the first to disappear. Without pumps and barriers, New Orleans, Amsterdam, and Venice would be underwater within years. Rising seas, already advancing in our age, would claim more and more ground. Waves would eat away at buildings. Storms would batter coastlines, and within centuries, cities would collapse into the ocean. To us, the ruins might be obvious for a time, but once they slip beneath the waves, their survival depends on a harsh lottery. Some might be buried under silt, preserved for a while. Most would be broken apart by currents, scattered by storms, and ground down into rubble. And in geological time, the ocean floor itself is not permanent. This is one of Earth's most startling facts. The seafloor is constantly being created and destroyed. New crust forms at mid-ocean ridges. Old crust is dragged down into the mantle at subduction zones. The result is that no seafloor is older than about 200 million years. That may sound like a long time, but compared to Earth's 4.5 billion year history, it is nothing. Entire oceans have opened and closed over and over again. Whatever was once built on their shores or fell into their depths is gone, not hidden, not buried, gone forever, recycled into molten rock. Even shipwrecks, which feel like permanent underwater museums, are not safe. The Titanic, resting just over a century on the seafloor, is already being consumed by metal-eating bacteria. In a few more decades, it may collapse entirely. If even the Titanic is dissolving in less than 200 years, what hope would there be for a building or a city or a civilization after millions? The silence of the ocean is deceptive. It hides, but it also destroys. For evidence to survive underwater, it must be buried quickly in low oxygen conditions, covered by sediments that protect it from corrosion and scavengers. Even then, survival is rare, and recognition is even rarer. A future geologist examining a layer of marine sediment might find a strange concentration of materials, but would they know it was a city once? Or would it look like nothing more than natural mineral deposits? This brings us to one of the most haunting possibilities. If a civilization existed tens of millions of years ago, it may have built its cities where we build ours, on the coasts, near the rivers, along the shorelines, and if that is true, then most of its memory is now under the sea. The ocean, relentless and patient, would have dismantled it long ago, and then the seafloor itself would have been destroyed, cleaved into the Earth's mantle. Entire civilizations could vanish this way, erased not just from sight but from existence, as though they had never been. This realization is sobering when we think of our own future. If humanity vanished tomorrow, what would endure? Our inland monuments might survive in some form, the pyramids, the Great Wall, Mount Rushmore. But our great cities, the skyscrapers of Manhattan, the streets of London, the sprawl of Shanghai, all would be gone, erased by rising seas and shifting coastlines. In 10,000 years, there would be little left to find. In 10 million years, there would be nothing. Our cities, which feel like eternal symbols of our presence, would be reduced to silence beneath the waves. And yet, sometimes the ocean does leave whispers. We have discovered ancient settlements drowned by rising seas after the last ice age. Off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean, divers have found submerged ruins. These are not millions of years old, but thousands. They remind us that water has always erased and always will. If the sea has already swallowed the traces of our own recent ancestors, what has it swallowed from ages far older? The ocean's silence forces us to face an uncomfortable truth. If civilizations before us lived and died, their greatest cities may already be gone, pulled into the sea and destroyed by time. What remains would not be monuments we could excavate, but subtle fingerprints hidden in sediments, chemical traces, unusual materials, or anomalies buried beneath layers of silt. And this leads us to a haunting question. When geologists examine the seafloor today, drilling cores and studying sediments, what if they are already holding fragments of something older? What if, mixed among volcanic ash and mineral layers, there are traces that do not belong, not ruins, not statues, but strange chemical signatures that no volcano or asteroid could explain? What if we have already seen them and explained them away as natural events, never realizing that they were the fish and echoes of a civilization drowned and forgotten? The silence of the ocean is not just the absence of sound, it is the absence of memory. And in that silence, civilizations can vanish without a trace. We look to the stars, asking whether we are alone, but perhaps the greater mystery lies not in space, but in the depths beneath our feet. The ocean keeps its secrets well, and perhaps within its silence it has already buried more than we dare to imagine. For most of this journey, we've looked at rocks, fossils, and chemistry. We've considered how the Earth erases, how civilizations are fragile, and what strange fingerprints might survive in deep time. But human beings are more than engineers and builders. We are storytellers. We remember not only through monuments, but through myths. And myths are strange things. They blur the line between memory and imagination, between history and dream. But what if, just what if, some of those myths are not pure invention? What if they are distorted echoes of something real, something older, something we no longer recognize? Every culture on Earth tells stories about the past, stories of floods that wiped out entire peoples, stories of golden ages when humans lived closer to the gods, Stories of great disasters, fires from the sky, or land swallowed by the sea. The Greeks spoke of Atlantis, a mighty civilization drowned in a single night. The Sumerians and Babylonians told of a flood that covered the world. In the Americas, in India, in China, in the Pacific, flood myths echo again and again. They are too widespread to be coincidence. Something about the human imagination clings to the idea of civilizations lost to water. The standard explanation is straightforward. At the end of the last ice age, about 12,000 years ago, glaciers melted and sea levels rose dramatically. Entire coastlines were swallowed. Villages, towns, perhaps even small cities disappeared beneath the waves. Humans living through that time would have experienced it as catastrophe. They would have told stories to explain it, and those stories would have grown into myths. Over centuries, the details would have blurred. A village swallowed by rising seas might become an entire continent lost to the ocean. A flood in one valley might become a flood that covered the world. Myths are memory reshaped by imagination, but weak. And if, buried within the exaggerations, there are fragments of truth that go deeper? What if the stories of lost ages, golden eras, and drowned civilizations are not just about the end of the ice age, but something even older? We cannot dismiss the possibility because memory is a strange thing. It does not preserve facts. It preserves feelings, impressions, the outlines of events. A catastrophe in the distant past might echo for millennia, transformed into legend until its original context is forgotten. Could myths be the only surviving whispers of civilizations erased by time? Consider Atlantis. Most historians agree that Plato invented it as an allegory, a story about hubris and downfall. Yet the idea of a great land swallowed by the sea resonates across cultures. Why? Why does this theme repeat so often? Is it simply because humans fear the ocean, because rising waters are an obvious metaphor for destruction? Or is it because at some point in the past, something like it really happened? Perhaps not Atlantis exactly, but a civilization or civilizations erased by rising seas, remembered only in fragments of story passed from generation to generation. And it is not only floods. Many myths speak of cycles of creation and destruction, of worlds that rise and fall. The ancient Hindus described vast cycles of time in which civilizations emerge, flourish, and are wiped away, only to be replaced by new ones. The Maya told of previous worlds destroyed by fire, flood, or monsters before the current age began. These may simply be symbolic stories, but they may also be intuitive recognition of something true, that the earth itself works in cycles, that civilizations, even ours, are not forever. And even in our own age, we see how quickly memory can distort. Ask 3 people to describe the same event, and you will hear 3 different stories. Multiply that by generations, by centuries, by thousands of years, and the original truth dissolves into metaphor. But still the outline remains: a flood, a fire, a fall from greatness. These outlines repeat across the world, across cultures that never contacted each other. Perhaps that is coincidence, or perhaps it is not. There is another possibility, darker still. Myths may not only remember the past, they may also be warnings. A flood story is not just about what happened long ago, but about what will happen again. A story of a lost golden age may not be nostalgia, but prophecy. If civilizations rise and fall in cycles, then perhaps our myths are not about one lost world, but about many, repeating endlessly, each forgotten in turn. In that case, we are not unique, we are simply the most recent. And our own story will one day join the silence, remembered only as a half-true myth by whoever comes after us. This idea that myths may be distorted memory changes how we look at human culture. Instead of dismissing ancient stories as superstition, we might see them as survival, as the last fragile link to things the earth has already erased. A myth of a flood may not prove a lost civilization, but it does prove that people lived through something catastrophic enough to echo for thousands of years. And if it happened once, it could have happened before, long before humanity as we know it. So when we listen to myths, we should listen carefully. Beneath the exaggeration, beneath the allegory, beneath the symbolism, there may be fragments of something real, not proof, not evidence in the scientific sense, but echoes. And echoes are often the only things that survive when the rest is gone. And here is the most unsettling thought. If civilizations before us have risen and fallen, erased by oceans, time and geology, then myths may be the only way their memory endures at all. We may already know of them, not through ruins or fossils, but through the stories we tell around fires, the legends we pass to children, the whispers that say, there were others before you and there will be others after you. We have traveled far, through deep time, through fossils and myths, through oceans and chemistry, through the ways Earth preserves and erases. And now we arrive at the most sobering realization of all. The record of existence itself is fragile, not just for ancient creatures, not just for forgotten civilizations, but for us, right now. Humanity, with all its technology, its global reach, its noise and lights and satellites, is still only a whisper in the geological story of Earth, and one day that whisper will fade. Think about how brief our presence has been. Anatomically, modern humans have existed for about 300,000 years. Civilization, meaning cities, writing, agriculture, just 10,000 years. Industrial society, barely 200 years. In the span of 4.5 billion years, we are a flicker. We have built monuments, mapped genomes, split the atom and reached into space. But in the vastness of time, we are fragile and temporary. If we disappeared tomorrow, the Earth would forget us almost immediately. And that is the great paradox. To us, our works feel eternal. To Earth, they are dust. Within decades of our absence, cities would crumble. Within millennia, forests and deserts would reclaim the land. Within millions of years, most evidence would be gone. A thin chemical layer might remain in sediments, carrying traces of our industry, plastics, carbon shifts, radioactive isotopes. But the grand symbols of our age, the monuments we imagine will last forever, would vanish. The pyramids, the skyscrapers, the great walls and dams and highways, gone. Even Mount Rushmore, carved in stone, would eventually weather into nothing but cliffs and rubble. And then, the unsettling question follows. If this is true for us, how many others have already come and gone? Civilizations that rose in ages long before us, leaving only faint anomalies in rock, or whispers in myth, or nothing at all. We can not answer with certainty. The silence of the record does not prove they never existed. It proves only that Earth is efficient at forgetting. This realization forces us to think differently about our place in time. We are not permanent residents. We are guests. Life on Earth has been through cycles of flourishing and collapse countless times. Mass extinctions have wiped out dominant species again and again. Entire lineages have thrived for millions of years, only to vanish without leaving descendants. Why would civilization be any different? Why would intelligence, technology, or culture be immune to the same cycles of rise and fall? Perhaps this is why the Silurian hypothesis matters so much. It does not claim that others were here. It reminds us that if they were, we may never know. The Earth does not promise to remember us. It does not promise to keep our legacy safe. It erases, it recycles, it renews. That is its nature. And so, if others came before, their memory is already gone, save for faint signals we might mistake for natural events. And if we fall, the same will happen to us. But there is another, more haunting possibility. What if we have already found the traces of others, but we did not recognize them? When geologists find abrupt shifts in carbon isotopes, or unexplained spikes in metals, or sudden extinctions, they attribute them to volcanoes, asteroids, or climate shifts. And perhaps they are right, but perhaps, once in a very long while, they are wrong. Perhaps at least one of those anomalies is not nature at work, but civilization lost, erased, and misunderstood. The thought is chilling because it means the answer to whether we are alone in Earth's history may already be in our hands. We simply do not yet know how to see it. And so we stand at a strange threshold. We look back into the deep past and see silence, but silence does not always mean emptiness. It may mean only that memory has been erased. And we look forward to the future and realize that one day we too will be erased. Our monuments will fall, our cities will vanish, our satellites will decay and burn, our names, our nations, our cultures, all will fade into geological oblivion. What will remain of us? A thin layer of chemicals, a faint line of isotopes, perhaps some stubborn microplastics locked into sediments. That will be our fossil, our monument, our entire story to those who come after, if there are any who come after. This is not a reason for despair. In a strange way, it is a reason for humility. It reminds us that we are part of a much larger story, a story that began long before us and will continue long after. We are not the first and we will not be the last. The record of existence is fragile, but existence itself is resilient. Life continues, it adapts, transforms, and renews. Civilizations may vanish, but the planet endures, carrying the possibility of new beginnings. And perhaps, just perhaps, that is the lesson of all this. To recognize that permanence is an illusion, that memory is fragile, that our works will fade. But in knowing this, we can also see the beauty of our fleeting moment. We are here now, we are conscious, we are capable of asking these questions, of wondering if others came before, of imagining futures yet to come. The earth may not remember us, but in this moment we remember ourselves. So what if we are not the first civilization on Earth? The truth is we may never know. But whether we are the first or only the latest in a long-forgotten line, the fragility of the record forces us to see our place clearly. We are temporary, we are vulnerable, and one day, like all who may have come before, we will vanish into the silence of deep time. The question is not whether Earth will remember us. The question is whether, while we are here, we remember what we are, a fleeting light in an ancient darkness, a fragile civilization on a restless world, living our brief chapter in a book that has no end.